you also, when you read Bacon, what you read is that Freud was deeply involved in the occult, the Kabbalah and the Gematria, and what you see also is this. I learned this as a technician. If someone had said to me, as a practitioner of psychoanalytic psychotherapy, if they had said, what are the most important points of psychoanalytic thought? From all the years of study, I would have said Freud's dealing with sex and aggression. That's what I would have said. But you know something? They never taught us a whole bunch of things that we needed to know. I don't know if they were aware of them themselves. The most graduate educational programs don't go into this. They specialize in psychology. It's specialized in clinical psychology in technique. You learned how to do something you didn't know. You didn't even think, well, why am I doing this? Does this have a theological point of view? Does this have an anthropology? What are the metaphysical connotations involved in this? Who thought about that? I never even thought about the term. If someone would have said, what's the anthropology of Freudian theory? I would have said, what do you mean anthropology? It's sociology. You got to study sociology and Margaret Mead to get into anthropology. I mean, I'm not an anthropologist. I'm a psychologist. Not knowing that I better take a look. Does this guy have a worldview that deals with his perception, his morality of God, of man, of the universe? And he sure did. See, his major contribution was not sex and aggression. That's an application of what his major contribution is. He is the one who stigmatized religion. I think he's one of the most important forces in bringing a stigma against Christianity. His most important books are not his books dealing with the technique of psychoanalysis. His most important books are The Future of an Illusion. You know what that illusion is? Christianity. Totem and Taboo, dealing with Judaism. Moses and monotheism again. Civilization and its discontents. These are philosophical and these are religious works. These are the underpinnings for a dramatic, deterministic model of man that held sway for over half a century. And I'm convinced one of the few reasons that there are several reasons that it's not as predominant today. One of them certainly is feminism, and feminism has done much to repudiate Freud's view of women, which is denigrating and demeaning. But the other is this. You know what the biggest difficulty with psychoanalysis? The cost. It's approximately $150 per psychoanalytic hour, and if you're in a real psychoanalysis, you're in 3 to 5 times a week. And health insurance policies cover $5,000 or so a year. You've got to be very, very wealthy. Some psychoanalysts for 3 or 4 or 5 years will only see 7 or 8 patients. Patients, they call them, they're sick. They got to be sick if they're paying $150 an hour 5 times a week. I mean, you got to be crazy to do that. But there's this determinism that's developed. And then, you see, this is from the old country. And it, perhaps had relationships to the experimental psychology that preceded it. So a natural evolution into some kind of psychic determinism developed. But in the United States, certainly there was a repudiation of this kind of determinism. And so the repudiation of a psychological and psychic determinism was met by another very, very strong force. And that force was behaviorism. It's not modern behaviorism now, but at that point in the early part of the 20th century, you have a man like J.B. Watson, who had been a teacher at Harvard University and was fired, and there were reasons they had to do with immorality charges. Of course, these things wouldn't be looked at now, but it took place then. He was let go from Harvard. He got involved in advertising, and I think he is some of the most powerful commercials advertising commercials can be attributed to Watson's work. But Watson was getting rid of, Watson, and later, of course, with the real father of what you'd have to call American behaviorism, not the classical conditioning of Watson and Pavlov, but of Skinner, the operant conditioning. Skinner, beyond, listen, here, what's his most famous book? Beyond Freedom and Dignity. They were radically opposed to the determinism of Freud. But you see, here's what's so fascinating. They just replaced one determinism with another. And you pick which is better. Well, whether you're psychically determined, or, as Skinner would say, you're just a black box, and there are circuits, and we can work those circuits as we please. In freedom, Beyond Freedom and Dignity, I said Freedom and Dignity because he wanted to call it that, but was convinced to change it to Beyond Freedom and Dignity. It was a good choice from a publishing and marketing perspective. I think it helped to sell a lot of books. Millions of copies of that book have been sold. It's the mantra, the Bible of the utopian schools of thought, behaviorist utopian schools of thought in America today. But he says in Beyond Freedom and Dignity, to man qua man we heartily say good riddance. Anything of value, hope, meaning, love, these are byproducts of the drives of man. There's biology, and there's neurology and neurochemistry, and we work on those areas, and what we do can direct the course of a person's life. We can work on those circuits by reinforcement contingencies and patterns of reinforcement. And we can make kids and adults do anything we please. You see an argument, or for all of this, you take a look at the movie Clockwork Orange from the early 1970s. It became a cult classic. Of course, though, this rejection of determinism was not totally acceptable to the free spirit of the American individualistic man. By the way, just let me mention, I thought of a commercial of Watson's. I remember it from growing up, and I think it lasted 20 years. You remember the guy who would walk into town, sit down at the bar, he was a cowboy, and he'd pull out his camels, and first he'd put his feet on the table, and he'd have a big hole in his boot, and then he'd take out a camel, he'd light it up and go, I'd walk a mile for a camel. That's Watson. He knew how to manipulate. And a generation of men saw themselves as, to be real macho, you had to smoke camels. That's behaviorism. That's conditioning. But that didn't strike the upbeat, optimistic note that American society was in following World War II. And it took another force. You see, I call that the first force, psychoanalysis. The second force, behaviorism. It took another individual of very charismatic proportions to deal with the void that people experienced either in a psychically determined universe or a behaviorally determined universe. American people did not want this. And into that void walks a man by the name of Carl Rogers. He says, I reject both. But listen, before he's rejecting a whole bunch of things. Growing up in the Midwest as an evangelical, a conservative, listen what happens. And this is triggered during lunch. We were talking about this. What made up Union Theological Seminary is the most liberal seminary even in those days. And I believe for Rogers it was in the 1920s. He started his study of theology. He was going for the ministry. I hope the name Carl Rogers, rings somewhat of a bell. He is the most popular psychotherapy in the world. And you know what surprised me? I had an opportunity to lecture at Moscow State University 2 years ago in their psychology department. And I was brushing up on my Pavlov and trying to talk Pavlov with them. They're going, hey, no, man, no. Carl Rogers. Well, Rogers. Rogers made it into Moscow.